Good morning, Ross Greer. How are you doing today?
Not bad, not bad. How's yourself?
I'm not too bad. It's a little bit too hot down south. I'm not gonna lie. We're freaking out a little bit. How's it north of the border?
Yeah, we had our first day north of 30 degrees yesterday. So if you've got my kind of complexion, becomes a threat to life pretty damn quickly.
Yeah, it's pretty intense. Another thing I just wanted to say actually to preface this discussion is that I am actually very proud of my Scottish heritage. My mum is from Scotland and my stepdad is, and I've got a lot of family there. I've been there many times. And it's a beautiful country, but one thing that you can never win with is the weather. It is often pretty dire up there, I'm afraid.
Yeah, we're expecting, I think, basically all four seasons today. So we've got sunshine, heat, thunderstorms. The temperature will drop really suddenly at one point. Like it's one of those days where if you want to go out in Scotland, you need to pack shorts, sun cream, hat, rain jacket, like woolly hat, all sorts of stuff.
Absolutely, absolutely. I also wanted to say that I'm all for Scottish independence because when this country, England, starts collapsing, I'd quite like to seek refuge in Scotland. Is that selfish of me?
No, you wouldn't believe how much we hear that. You wouldn't believe how much we hear that. Either a combination of folk who think that with climate crisis and rising sea levels, they can literally seek refuge in Scotland, or just a broader point of political despair. They think that an independent Scotland's their escape route.
That's something to be proud of. I hope that people want to escape to you. But
Yeah, we just need to live up to all those expectations.
yeah, totally. But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today, Ross. I think it's amazing that you're so young and deep in the heart of politics. I'm very passionate about young people becoming more engaged in politics, and it's very refreshing to hear people who you feel as a young person that you feel like you can relate to in these spaces. Because obviously, as I'm sure you're aware, there's so many reasons why young people are cynical about politics. But maybe to start with, it'd be really interesting to hear about your own journey into politics and what kind of sparked that journey for you.
Yeah, it's a funny one. So I was elected to the Scottish Parliament in 2016, so I was 21 at that point. And that election was otherwise a little bit boring. Like the campaign had been average, and the result was again average. So journalists were like looking for some interesting, what they would call color stories, to try and liven the thing up the day after the results. And me being the youngest ever MSP, that was part of it. And they were all asking me this same question and looking for that eureka moment. Like, what was that moment that you realized as a young person that politics is what you wanted to do? I think I kind of disappointed them when I said that I don't really have that one eureka moment, but I don't come from a political family. Like my parents have always voted, but that's like the extent of their political engagement. They've never been members of political parties or anything like that. I have one uncle who's very active in the trade union movement, but that's really it for the extent of my broader family's politics. For whatever reason, though, I was just always kind of interested in politics in general, but specifically around the environment and the climate crisis. And I joined the Greens when I was 15, so I thought I could just keep getting angry about this stuff, or I could try and do something about it. Like I could keep tweeting my frustration, I could shout at question time, which I've long since given up even watching, or I could go try and do something about it. And I joined the Scottish Greens when the party had like 900 people in it. So there were more people in my high school than there were in the party I joined. But I joined the party I believed in. And it actually took me years before I figured out what I think is probably behind all that. I grew up in the Church of Scotland. I'm still very, very involved. I'm a Christian, definitely committed to that as an adult. Um, but what I eventually realized was, I think it was being brought up in the church, hearing those gospel stories and feeling called to do something, feeling called to campaign for justice, to campaign for the transformation on earth. If you want to use the theological language, building the kingdom on earth. It took me ages, even probably after I got elected. So 10 years after I started getting involved in politics, I thought, that was probably the trigger. It was probably, growing up in Sunday school and having these lessons taught to us about this radical message of hope and transformation and justice, and thinking, yeah, I should probably do something about that. So there was no one moment where there was this kind of tipping point and I suddenly realised. But there probably was a tipping point a year or two after I got elected where I thought, oh, that was why. It was Sunday school. That's probably what turned me into a communist, which isn't what most people say.
Right. I mean, that's fascinating. Yeah, I think a lot of people could probably attest to realizing why they've done something as a kind of hindsight thing, as opposed to while they're doing it, knowing exactly why they're doing something. Do you feel any pressures from being the youngest ever MSP elected, and like as in the pressure to represent young people?
Yeah, it's a funny one, and sometimes there's competing pressures that I really need to work out. That's lessening as I get older. It's 4 years on now. I've just turned 26. I don't feel like a young person nearly as much as I did then. And the running joke was always that whilst I'm technically a young person, we're not sure whether I've ever authentically been a young person. But the interesting thing for me, particularly once I got elected in the first year or two, was the tension between being Scotland's youngest ever MSP and being the Green MSP for the West of Scotland. Because what I was finding was I was getting all sorts of extra opportunities, extra platforms to speak from because I was the youngest MSP, and for whatever reason that was interesting or relevant to something that was going on. But people didn't want me to be particularly political. They wanted to talk to me as just the youngest MSP, whereas I was not elected as Scotland's youngest MSP. That's not what it said on the ballot paper. What it said was Ross Greer's Scottish Green Party, and I'm a Green MSP. I have a green agenda to advance on behalf of the people that I represent. So it was this kind of interesting tension of there were people who really wanted me to come and talk about like really safe subjects, like talk about getting more young people involved in politics, or how does social media change how we communicate with young people, but to do that in a really soft and almost depoliticized way. They wanted me to talk about politics in the most depoliticized way possible, because when I actually started talking about politics properly, what I was talking about was often quite challenging for the people who'd invited me and given me the platform, because green politics is radical, and what I want to see and what I'm trying to achieve is radical. So I was finding that I could use these extra platforms to advance this radical agenda, and that was great. But I was often coming up against this bit of tension of that's not what people wanted from me, and I had to kind of explain to some people, and it was only some people, of course, but I had to explain to them, no, like, it's great that you want to talk to the youngest MSP, and as I was a youth worker before I was elected, I'm a youth worker now, I will happily talk to you about getting young people more involved in politics and wider society and affecting change. But I am an MSP because people voted Green, and I am here as a Green MSP, and I want to talk about that. And I would be letting young people down if I didn't talk about what I believe are the fundamental changes that we need. Our generation are far more invested in the fight against the climate crisis than previous generations. Our generation want to talk about the housing crisis. We want to talk about precarious work and 0 hours contracts and low wages. I'm not just going to come and talk to people about, if you want to speak to young people, you should probably get an Instagram account. And I think that's what some folk just wanted me to say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What do you say to that kind of age-old argument of voting Green being a wasted vote?
Well, we've got this massive advantage in Scotland of proportional representation. So broadly, in a Scottish Parliament election and in our council elections, if you vote Green, you will get Green. It's a fair-ish system. Like, it could be better, and we use two different systems for them. But in a Scottish Parliament election, you get 2 votes. One's for your constituency MSP, so that's the same as Westminster. It's just first past the post. Whoever gets the most votes in that seat wins it. But then the second vote, you elect a group of regional MSPs, and that's proportional. So what we've been able to prove in Scotland, particularly since 2016, with 6 Green MSPs is not only if you vote Green will you elect a Green, and almost everyone in Scotland has at least one Green MSP. There are 8 regions and 6 of us, although we represent 5 because we've got 2 in one region. But we've been able to demonstrate to people that when they vote Green, green things actually happen. So it's not just that the 6 of us are in Parliament saying the things that people want. We've been able to actually do them. So we were elected on a platform that said, we need to raise more money for essential public services, and we need to raise that money from the rich. Well, the SNP don't have a majority. They need at least one other party to help them pass things like budgets. And because of wider political the wider political environment in Scotland around independence. They really depend on us to do that. So in practice, what that meant was the Greens got to rewrite the income tax system in Scotland. So the rich pay a little bit more tax in Scotland, people on lower incomes pay a little bit less. And over the last couple of years, we've put £500 million back into our public services. We've saved libraries and schools and swimming pools and things like that from being closed. Earlier this year, we got free bus travel for under 19s secured for the whole of Scotland. It won't happen until next year, but it was this year that we negotiated it. So we've been able to prove that if you vote Green, not only will you elect a Green, but you will actually see Green changes start to happen. And don't get me wrong, still come across loads of people out there who don't know that there are any Greens in the Scottish Parliament, or think that it's nice that we're there, but we don't have very much influence, or whatever it might be. But the more you talk to people about it, and certainly we've come a long way in the last 4 years, I think people are genuinely surprised, but they're overwhelmingly positive about it. Like 7% of people voted Green, but most people in Scotland, going by all the polling that's been done, support the kind of stuff that we're doing. Most people in Scotland think that the rich should pay more tax to keep our public services going. People are really supportive of giving under 19s free bus travel. So we've been able to achieve this stuff, and it has, I think, really significantly moved public opinion, not just around us as a party, but this idea that if you vote for what you want, you might actually get it, because the Greens have proven that.
Right. All fascinating stuff. Do you think one of the reasons why young people are sometimes disillusioned by politics is due to the fact that they don't have the options that represent them? Like, I know we have the Green Party, and a lot of young people do identify with the Greens, but do you think it's almost like an option issue? There aren't the options that young people want.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think disillusion's the right word for it. There's a Scottish trade unionist, Jimmy Reid, who led a work-in at the Upper Clyde shipyards in the 70s, really famous trade unionist in Scotland. And he gave a speech where he talked about the difference between alienation and apathy. Now, he was largely talking about the working class, but I think it absolutely applies to young people at large as well. And he was making the point that people are not apathetic about politics. I've never met anyone who had no opinions whatsoever, but I meet people all the time who are completely alienated from our political systems, who are completely disillusioned by them. They don't feel empowered at all. And Natalie Bennett, who used to be the leader of the Greens in England, had a great way of talking about it. She was saying that politics at the moment is something that's done to people, and we need to turn it into something that we all do together. And that's at the heart of Green politics. There are 4 key pillars to Green politics, no matter which Green party in the world you go and speak to. And one of them is about grassroots or radical democracy. So we've always been really committed to that idea that if we give people more power and more choice to actually make decisions, then people will be more engaged, and you will get better outcomes as well. And yeah, we see that in the UK with, for the UK's main election. I would say the main election in Scotland's the Scottish Parliament election, but the UK is the state that we exist in. The UK's Parliament is the primary election, and most people don't get the MP they vote for because of first past the post. That's an unbelievable idea that almost 2/3 of people won't get the MP that they actually vote for. That's not a healthy democracy. And what it means is people think, well, why should I bother? Like, most people live in safe seats where the result isn't in any doubt. And if you live in a safe seat where the result isn't in any doubt, why would you bother voting? And if voting isn't going to do anything, and that's the most basic form of political engagement you can get involved with, it's really off-putting to this idea that you can go and do other things. And we've seen that with, more than 1 million people voting Green, but only 1 out of 650 MPs being Green, because we won a seat in Brighton Pavilion, but first past the post kept us out of the UK Parliament everywhere else. But then you see it on a larger level as well, where young people overwhelmingly voted for Labour under Jeremy Corbyn. The population at large clearly didn't. But his politics were also being deliberately sabotaged from within his own party. The hostility of the media towards him and his agenda was completely at odds with where a lot of young people sat on the kind of policies he was talking about. I think young people see a political system full of people that don't look like them. It doesn't look like it's something that they can get into. It doesn't look like it's something they can influence from the outside. And that's really disempowering. But when you break that down, whether it's, folk like when Mary Black got elected to the UK Parliament, and Mary and I represent the same area, we are the same age. Mary was the youngest, she is the youngest MP, I'm the youngest MSP. When people see folk who look and sound a bit more like them, they think, all right, okay, maybe this is actually a little bit more accessible for folk like me. But it's not just about having someone that looks and sounds like you. It's also about feeling represented. Like, the best example is from America rather than here, where the American politician who is by far and away the most popular with young people is Bernie Sanders, who's almost 80 years old. But he talks about the issues that young people care about, and he does it authentically. You can trust him. I think that's what young people are looking for. But for me, the other part of it is, it's not just about making electoral politics more accessible and for young people to feel that's something for them. It's about making people realize that voting and electoral politics isn't the only way to affect change. And politics is so much more than elections. So making people feel like they can affect change in their own community, or they can get involved in campaigns to affect change nationally or even internationally. Convincing folk that they have the power to do that is really hard. But when you do convince them of that, amazing, amazing stuff happens. And we saw that in Scotland in 2014, where the population at large suddenly realized, oh my God, our vote here really counts. But actually, if we go and get involved in this campaign, then we're really contributing to something that might be transformational and radical. And we saw all sorts of positive stuff come out of that. The campaign to ban fracking in Scotland came out of the Yes campaign. It was Yes activists who then drove that forward. The campaign to stop the construction of a new women's prison that we didn't need was driven by the Women for Independence campaign group who'd been set up to campaign for Yes. People, through that one democratic experience, suddenly realized, oh wow, we can actually affect change in a whole bunch of other ways. And these were the people who lost the referendum. This was my side who lost, but who realized, wow, politics is actually something that we can do, and we don't even need to get elected to do it.
Brilliantly said. I mean, one of the greatest frustrations I've had about politics is this reduction to it being something that happens once every 4 years, that it's only something you can participate in one day out of 4 years. For me, just seems like absolute craziness, because there's so much we can be doing in our own lives to create political change. And that's not to discredit the value of voting and participating. But yeah, I think it's important that people have a real clear understanding of where the alienation and apathy comes from.
Yeah, and it suits the people who are in power if the rest of the population think that politics is just something you do once every 4 years. That
Exactly.
is absolutely in the best interests of the people who are already running our politics and our economy and our media, etc. And I think the rest of us would really like a radically different group of people to be running our politics and our economy and our media. But until people genuinely believe and feel empowered in their ability to go out and do politics every day and to affect change all the time, and for us to collectively do that, the ruling class are laughing because they've got a monopoly on it for the other 364 days of the year and the other 3 out of every 4 years.
Exactly. And on that kind of leads to my next question. If there is an agenda to keep politics rigid and unappealing, and completely dominated by a ruling class, or people who have gone to Eton, what ways can we challenge that? And that might seem silly, but if there is an actual agenda to prevent politics changing radically for the better, what can we do?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely believe that is part of their agenda. They don't want politics to be widened out because it doesn't suit them. I mean, you look at the people who run the UK and the people who've always ran the UK go to the same schools and the same universities. They go to Eton and Harrow and Westminster School, and then they go to Oxford and Cambridge. And they are friends. Half of them are related to each other. I mean, David Cameron was distantly related to the Queen. Like, it is one tiny group within a population of 65 million who run our country and have always run our country. And they feel extremely threatened by people coming in from the outside. But that's exactly what we need to do. We need to threaten their hold on politics and on the media and on the economy. And there are structural ways to do that, and there are wider cultural ways to do it. So I think the most obvious structural way that we can increase participation in politics and make people believe that they can do it is by actually educating people about it properly. Most people will leave school not knowing what their local council does, what the UK Parliament does, or in our case, what the Scottish Parliament does, or the Welsh Assembly, or the Northern Irish Assembly. They won't know what the London Assembly does, what the Perth, the regional mayor has. Most people will leave school having not got a broad political education. Now, I try and avoid using the phrase political education because it sounds like a camp in Maoist China that you're going to send people to. But if we talk about civic education, what I believe we need to do is across the UK, and obviously with different curriculums and different setups, but in every part of the UK, I've certainly been campaigning for this in Scotland, every young person should leave school having got a basic civic education about how our politics works and how they can participate in it. So I chose politics as a subject when I was in the senior phase of high school, unsurprisingly. And we have another subject in Scotland called Modern Studies that's kind of like it. So I chose both of them. So through that, I learned about socialism, conservatism, liberalism, etc. Not about green politics, but the teacher actually asked me to tell everyone else about green politics because it wasn't in the curriculum yet. But that was a very small group of people. So like 10% of the folk in my school actually learned what different political ideologies are and what power even is. So the first thing you do in the politics course is to learn what power actually is. And, you know, like this idea that, you know, states get their legitimacy from the fact that they can legitimately use force. That's what makes a state, right? These basic political ideas. So most people don't get that. So they will leave school not having a clear understanding of how the world around them actually works. And if you don't have a clear understanding of it, how can you be expected to participate and to make change? What I want to see is everyone leaving school with an understanding of the different levels of government in this country and how they all actually work, and a basic sense of political ideas and how we come up with them. I don't think, I don't want everyone to come out of school believing exactly the same thing I do on an ideological level, but I think if you actually start explaining the broad spectrum of political ideologies to people, a lot more people will realize that they are actually on the left and indeed on the radical left. But it's that basic idea of empowerment. I want every young person to leave school feeling like they can actually change the world. Because when we see young people get up and do that, it actually happens. Like Greta Thunberg being the best example from the last couple of years. Young people can be incredibly powerful, but they're not, on the whole, encouraged to be, and they're not shown how they can be. We've got this amazing opportunity if we just deliver that. So it's something really basic. Every young person should leave school having got civic education. It shouldn't be a subject that you have to choose. Keep, the subjects that you can choose, that's great, but as part of like the core curriculum around what we call in Scotland personal social education or health and well-being. So when you would usually learn about sex and relationships, drugs and alcohol, mental health, etc., core civic education has to be part of that, because if we don't tell people how the world works, how do we expect them to change it? And I want people to be going out and changing the world, because I think the only way to create the kind of lasting change we need is through mass movements. And you can only get a mass movement if a substantial number of people actually want to take part and believe they can take part. So that's the kind of structural bit of it. The cultural stuff, that's much harder, and it requires follow through, because even if we started tomorrow to have civic education for every young person, the adult population at large still haven't got it. And the breadth of political knowledge in the adult population goes from those who are intensely involved in politics and who have a really deep understanding, to people who don't actually think they have any political opinions, don't think politics has anything to do with them, but are usually at the sharp end of it, are usually having their life profoundly impacted by political decisions that are being made every single day. They just feel so detached from that system because no one's even shown them how it works and who's making the decisions that are affecting their life. So that wider cultural change within the adult population, that requires like what you might call it popular education. You can't rely on traditional structures of education because most adults are past those. But it's just about normalizing that. Like it's not normal in this country to have public meetings and town halls where most of the community turn up to talk about what they actually want to do. That only usually happens when they're trying to defend themselves from something. So like bad planning applications to gentrify an area or closing the local hospital or something. What I want to see, and one of the easiest way to do this, is if you just start handing communities power, then they tend to rise to the challenge. So we've seen this a little bit in Scotland, where we gave various communities a section of the council's budget. you hive off a couple of percent of the council's budget, which big council, so it's still a couple of £1 million in most cases, and you invite the community to the primary school assembly hall or something, and there's a range of different community groups, a range of different options, and the local community, everyone who turns up from the local community gets to debate and discuss and ask questions, and then collectively vote and decide how that money is spent. And what we found is when you do that, that participation budgeting, communities tend to make really good decisions because they actually know what needs done in their area, and they know where the money should be spent and where it would have its best impact. So just handing power to people, handing power to the community at large, it generally results in good outcomes, and it can be done right now. Like, part of it is education. Part of it is just saying, if you hand people power, on the whole, they rise to the challenge.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, as we all know, education is such an important part of it. And I know for me personally, citizenship studies, which I believe was scrapped by the Conservative government, was absolutely crucial for me, just learning about things like the civil rights movement or the Stephen Lawrence case, just things that I just wouldn't have known about if it hadn't been for citizenship studies, which was actually deemed a bit of a silly subject that wasn't worth paying any attention to, which is a subject where you're actually learning about important things in society. In fear of frying both of our brains with politics and whatnot, I thought it might just be interesting as well to hear how you've been coping personally through this whole pandemic.
Yeah, it's been a funny one because at the start of the pandemic, I mean, obviously, this has been a horrendous situation for a huge number of people, and far more people have lost their lives in the UK than was ever unavoidable. So many of these deaths have been avoidable. I've been really blessed in that I've not been affected by it. No one in my direct family has been, although I know others who have. But even, kind of beyond all that, in terms of the lockdown itself, I remember at the start of it, so many of my friends who were being furloughed, or studies were ending, or whatever it was, and we were like, "Oh, it's amazing! I'm going to be able to plow through my Netflix list. I'm just going to sit and play PlayStation games. I'm just going to go for a walk or read books or whatever." And I sat at the start of it and I thought, "All right, cool. I've got this massive list of stuff on Netflix. I'm always adding more stuff to it at a quicker rate than I'm actually watching it. I've got stacks and stacks of books. Maybe I'll actually start getting through all this." But my workload has just exploded during this. I'm at home, but I am working longer hours than when I was working from my office in my own community or through in Parliament. And don't get me wrong, it's been good work. It's been nice and rewarding, and the breadth of stuff's been incredible because you've got folk are just getting in touch about all sorts of different stuff that they need a bit of help or assistance with. Folk could just need answers to basic questions. I got one in yesterday from someone whose business is an arcade. The guy runs an arcade, but he's not clear reading the lockdown documents whether he'll be able to open up in the next phase for non-essential retail. Doesn't know if an arcade is non-essential retail or if it is classed as live entertainment, in which case it's later. So stuff like that. But then I've had folk getting in touch because their family got free school meals when schools were actually in, and when schools closed, they stopped getting support. The council was actually offering an alternative, but they'd fallen through the cracks, and stuff like that needed fixed. Or folk who were trying to be evicted by their landlord, or in one case, someone who had absolute crisis, no money, couldn't heat their home, couldn't afford any food. I managed to work with a local church. We got a crisis grant for them. Someone went around and gave them a food parcel. So you've got all that going on, doing the local stuff. And then I ended up on 3 different committees in Parliament, which is just a ridiculous workload. So I'm on the Education Committee, I'm on the Parliament's new COVID Committee, and I'm on the committee that has a ridiculously long title. It is the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Relations Committee, which in practice was our main Brexit committee up until now, because of course Brexit is still actually going on. It's just gone further down the list of crises that we need to deal with. So I feel like my whole life has just been, I've been sitting in the same room. I'm either in my bedroom or in my living room, in front of my laptop, just on emails or on video calls or whatever. The one nice bit of relief has been, I still run the youth group for my church. And in an interesting observation about how young people engage with church, I have obviously our the youth group meets online now, and I've moved it from Sunday morning to Friday afternoon. More of them now attend every week with the online meeting on a Friday than physically were turning up to church on a Sunday morning. So that's been my bit of relief, is each week on a Friday afternoon, I'll be doing it later on. I just get to chat shit with the teenagers that I've known since they were like little kids, and that's just a nice bit of relief for me every week. That's what's been keeping me sane.
That's nice. Have you, another like sort of positive thing that strangely happened during this pandemic was, you know, is the Black Lives Matter movement, and seeing the old Colston statue fall, which was in Bristol, which is a city that I've spent a lot of time in and I've got a close relationship with. You caught my attention first on the Piers Morgan show, and I just want to say on behalf of everyone who feels the same as me that it was an absolute delight to watch you basically push Piers Morgan into a little corner where he got scared and turned into a scared little boy. And calling him a snowflake was the icing on the cake, I think, because ironically, I think, you know, as much as people like him want to call, you know, young people snowflakes, there's a total sensitivity that they have around figures like Winston Churchill, right? And an amazing defensive barrier that comes up when people challenge traditional ideas about cultural figures. And I think, I don't know, I just think you did a brilliant job of staying composed and calm and just answering the questions where you were allowed to without being shouted over. Well, so thank you for that.
Thanks very much.
Do you think that there has been some progress in the conversation thanks to the Colston statue falling at all?
Yeah, I mean, what's happened in the UK in the last couple of weeks has been absolutely massive. I mean, the transformation in America has been huge. I saw a poll yesterday that showed that the Black Lives Matter movement is more popular in America, obviously, than Trump, but it's more popular than Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee as well. Like, if you polled on Black Lives Matter and whether most of the American population approve or disapprove of it a couple of months ago, most would have disapproved. And I mean, you go back to the 60s and Martin Luther King, and the folk are lionizing him now. I think you would have hated him in the 60s. Consistently, every poll that was done throughout his civil rights movement showed that everything they were doing was opposed by a majority of the American population and an overwhelming majority of the white population. And now they are, you know, they have won history. They were clearly in the right. And you've got various people, in fact, some people who were even around then who are now speaking a very different tune. But in the UK, it's been really interesting because whilst that element of American history has always been at the forefront, and actually I think it's weirdly been at the forefront here as well. Like, I think more people in the UK probably know about the Montgomery bus boycott and the efforts in America than know that there was a bus boycott in Bristol. More people in the UK are informed to some extent about the US civil rights movement than the UK civil rights movement. But the interesting thing that on one level just seems so obvious, but that has absolutely stunned this massive section of our population is most statues in this country weren't put up to good people to celebrate the good things they've done. It's not that good people get statues, it's that powerful people get statues, or certainly got them in the Victorian era, where most of the statues that are up at the moment went up. They were putting statues up to rich and powerful men. That was it. Like, that's why the overwhelming majority of statues are to rich white men. And things are beginning to change. But I think most folk just hadn't even appreciated that that statue is there to that guy because he's rich, and he's rich because he bought and sold slaves. And in the case of Edward Colston, you know, 80,000 people were kidnapped and enslaved by him and his efforts. 20,000 of them died before they even got to America. Of those 20,000, there were disproportionately children who didn't survive that journey. And people just didn't know that. Now, there's a section of the population who either did know it and were comfortable with it, or have found out now, but are still opposed to the Black Lives Matter movement and still think it was wrong to take down the statue or whatever. Unpicking that and unpicking why they often feel personally threatened by it because their sense of national identity is threatened, that's really interesting. But to me, the much more positive effect has just been a huge section of the population who've suddenly thought, oh shit, these are bad guys. Why have we got statues to bad guys? Everywhere, like absolutely everywhere. And for those of us who've been campaigning on this kind of stuff for a long time, it's just suddenly become so much easier. Not easy, but easier than it was. And we've got the same in Glasgow, our merchant city in Glasgow. Those were merchants of tobacco and cotton and slavery. There's a reason that we've got streets in Glasgow called things like Jamaica Street and Virginia Street, and the other streets that are just named after slave owners. And suddenly people are thinking, yeah, we need to do something about that. We need to change that. Whereas when those of us who were proposing that before were talking about it, you got a lot of hostile responses. And what I think it ultimately came down to is just that the overwhelming majority of people aren't aware of the overwhelming majority of the UK's history. Like, people just don't know British history. British people don't know British history. If you go to India or Ireland or Kenya, people often know more about what Britain did over the last 300 years than people here do, because we were doing it in those countries and they are still bearing the scars and the after effects of it. But here, folk are stunned to find out. It's like the Mitchell and Webb show sketch where they come to that realization: are we the bad guys?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Like, the indisputable answer is, for a huge chunk of the last few centuries, Britain was the bad guy. We were the invading, destructive, murdering force. We were driving slavery. We were driving colonialism. And it's okay to admit that. And it's healthy to admit that. And we are now in a place in society, it's taken far too long, but we're now in a place in society where maybe we can just talk about that openly, accept it, and figure out how we move on and how we make amends as appropriate. And doing something as basic as taking down a statue to a slaver, like, that's now actually relatively straightforward. Whereas, as we saw with the Colston statue, it was impossible. People had to take it into their own hands after years and decades of the community diligently trying through the quote unquote correct channels to get something done about that statue. They just took it into their own hands. And not only have they changed Bristol, but I think they've changed the UK as a whole, and the effects of it are being felt across the world. Statues weren't being pulled down in America until people in Bristol pulled down the statue of Colston. And now we've got statues of, Confederate generals who fought to keep people in chains are being pulled down all over the place. Something brilliant is happening there.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, because sometimes I'm a little bit mixed on, have mixed feelings about it all, but I think overwhelmingly there's a lot of positive to be gained from it all. However, I do think there is something interesting to explore within that, the nuances of national identity. And I think that someone like Colston, for whatever reason, we have to understand that he is a different figure to Winston Churchill. They are different people. And I think with someone like Colston, it's fairly obvious that someone who made his money off one of the most despicable trades ever known to man shouldn't have a statue in that sense. And I think there's the clear argument that, often people who do bad things engage in philanthropy in order to kind of alleviate themselves of any kind of burden of the bad things they've done. But for someone like Winston Churchill, I can understand, while I completely, your arguments that you made on Piers Morgan were brilliant and correct and articulated well, I do think there's got to be some kind of nuanced approach to someone like Winston Churchill being held as such a precious thing to the British identity. And I don't mean to say he shouldn't be called out for what he's done, but I think in the same ways that you might look at the British Empire and say it did a lot of evil and it did a lot of bad, you do have to understand the whole picture and understand that it was a time of empire, a lot of bad things were happening. How do we understand this in a context? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, the Churchill example is the strongest one, because if you think of any individual in history who is more the embodiment of British identity, it's Winston Churchill or the Queen. But really, like, Churchill is so at the core of how so many people define British identity, and in turn how they define their own identity. Now, for me, that's a little bit more interesting coming from Scotland, because it's a different, like, British identity in each part of the UK is different. I think people often forget that. Like, there's a portrayal as if British identity in Britain is one monolithic thing, and it's not. And again, if you look at public attitudes in Scotland, most people in Scotland either identify as entirely Scottish and not British, or more Scottish than British. And what British identity means in Scotland is a little bit different. So Scotland, like British identity in my bit of Scotland, West Central Scotland around Glasgow, is often, not always, but often tied up in loyalist identity in a kind of similar-ish way to Northern Ireland. That's really quite different to what it is elsewhere. But if we're talking about the kind of at-large British identity, what it is in popular culture across the UK, Churchill's at the core of it. And I think it's really interesting because it shows just how incredibly centered British identity is on one event, the Second World War. How we define ourselves by the role, how we define ourselves as a country by the role we played in that war. And indisputably, we were on the right side of history there. Like, we should be proud, we should be unequivocally proud of the fact that not only did we stand against fascism, but British people, alongside Americans and French and Russians and 2 million men of the British Indian Army, etc., we marched from one side of Europe to the other to not just defeat, but to destroy the most evil empire in human history. We can be easily and comfortably proud of that. But the problem is, it's exactly what you said. It's about nuance. And people find nuance really hard, because then you start to unpick stuff that's a little bit more difficult or a little bit more uncomfortable, or some stuff that's just downright awful and unacceptable, and realize it's not actually that simple. And it's because we want the world to be a series of black and whites, and we want there to always be good guys and bad guys, and it's much more comfortable for us if we're always the good guys, or we're always associated with the good guys. But it's not that simple, right? Because Britain might have clearly been one of the good guys in the context of the struggle against Nazi Germany, but then at the same time, we starved 3 to 4 million people in the Bengal famine in India. Even after that, Winston Churchill was Prime Minister again in the 50s and had concentration camps built in Kenya. And that's something that really gets certain people it really gets them offended, because, again, because our understanding of history at large and of modern history is so centered on the Second World War, so incredibly centered on the war in Europe. You use the word concentration camp and people think you're making a direct equivalence between us and the Nazis. And that's not the case. For a start, there's a difference between a concentration camp and an extermination camp. But concentration camps were invented by the British in the Boer War and were still being used by the British in the 50s. There are people alive today who were tortured and held in British concentration camps in Kenya in the 1950s. And the fact that we can't, as a country at large, acknowledge that happened is problematic. Never mind talk about making amends for it and accepting that it was unequivocally wrong. There's a quite substantial section of the population who cannot and will not acknowledge that happened at all. And even before you get to horrific acts like that, the interesting thing that I often try to bring the Churchill debate back to was the offence I caused for some people by describing Winston Churchill as a white supremacist. And when they were getting incredibly offended and saying, how dare you describe him like that? I would point out that Winston Churchill said that whites are a superior race. And he said that in the context of justifying what had happened to black Africans, i.e. slavery, and what had happened to Native Americans and Aboriginal Australians, genocide. So to justify genocide and slavery, Winston Churchill said that whites are a superior race. So for people to get offended that I called him a white supremacist, but to not be offended that he said whites are a superior race, requires an incredible level of cognitive dissonance. And it usually comes down to the fact that people don't know he said that, because we don't talk about that, right? We have boiled down British history to, we were the good guys in the Second World War, Winston Churchill led us and we defeated the Nazis. Therefore, British history is good, and Britain is a force for good in the world. And that creates an environment where, if you want to acknowledge what actually happened, if you want to acknowledge historical fact, and if you want to have a more nuanced and a more complicated and a more realistic discussion, people get incredibly offended because they're not prepared for that. They're not prepared for it, and it jars so much with what they have been brought up to believe is not just British history, but therefore British identity now. And if British identity is tied to their personal identity, that's when they start to get on a really emotional level offended and they feel threatened. That's why there was this massive differential in the kind of response I was getting. Don't get me wrong, there were people in Scotland, and it was generally associated with that kind of loyalist sense of British identity, who were incredibly angry with me, who were incredibly threatening to me. But there was this big section of the Scottish population who don't identify as British at all, or don't particularly identify as British, who were much more relaxed about that, even if they didn't agree with me. And plenty of people obviously did agree with me, and I would wager more people in Scotland proportionately agreed than in other parts of the UK, certainly than in England. But people were more relaxed about it, whereas in England, I find, and I'd be interested what you think of this, English identity and British identity are much more closely aligned than Scottish and British identity are. There's a distinct Scottish identity, and the way there's a pretty distinct Welsh identity as well. English and British identity are so tied together because English identity has largely defined British identity. And I think that meant that a proportionately much bigger section of the English population felt as if I was personally criticising and insulting them when I pointed out things that Churchill had actually said and done. And that wasn't what I meant to do. But at the same time, if it caused some people, and by no means do I think it caused this for everyone, but if it caused some people to either have a little bit of self-reflection or just maybe to be open to the idea that history isn't quite as simple as they thought and Britain isn't as unequivocally a force for good as they thought, then hopefully that did some good. And what I hope is that what I did last year, and it was January 2019 that I did that series of interviews about Churchill, I hope it made it a little bit easier for the folk who are now leading the movement, not just for racial justice in the UK, but for a reckoning with our own history, that I made it just a tiny bit easier, and that I used my privilege as a white man in elected office to say something that was, dangerous for me, and I received plenty of threats for it, but that is definitely more dangerous and would have been more dangerous if it was, for example, a young woman of colour who was on TV saying it. We only need to look at the kind of threats and abuse that young women of colour receive all the time, particularly those who have a public profile. If I made it a little bit easier for that conversation to move on and for the next person to talk about it, if I made it easier for the people who are alive now, or the people from communities now who were devastated and negatively affected by this stuff, to talk about their own history, then great. I mean, I got an email from a group of folk from the Bengali community in Scotland who just emailed me to say thank you. They said, no one in this country talks about our history. No one in Britain talks about the fact that Britain starved our families and that 4 million of our people died. And they just said, thank you. Thank you for telling people that that actually happened and that it happened within living memory and that we would have more relatives today if it hadn't happened. They were just grateful that someone had acknowledged that it exists. And I think we're in a really unhealthy place where huge sections, I would argue most of our history over the last couple of centuries, is something that a lot of people struggle to acknowledge even happened at all. Before we get to debate about whether it was right or wrong, we're in a place where a big chunk of our population can't and won't acknowledge that our history actually happened. So they built a myth up instead, and that's not healthy.
Yeah, totally agree, man. And yeah, it's a very complicated issue, and of course we know that there was an effort to make people unaware of this history. I don't know if you're familiar with Operation Legacy, but it essentially involved the British government destroying colonial documents, which is another thing that we don't know about. I think it is very interesting as well that the reason why we can see Nazi Germany as the evil is because they lost, essentially. If Nazi Germany had won the war or whatever, I'm pretty sure in present Nazi Germany they probably would have a similar issue with reconciling with their past. But what you mentioned about English and British identity is a very interesting thing, and I think I'm sure there's plenty of English people who have a strange relationship with the concept of being called British and everything. I sometimes wonder if I feel privileged in some ways to have mixed heritage. I've got my father's side of the family on the recipient end of colonialism and racism, and then my other side of the family aren't. So I sometimes wonder to what extent I have a role in helping to understand that identity is not this one thing, it is a shifting thing with different dimensions to it. And quite frankly, I want to be proud of the country I was born in. You know, I don't think we all have this, desire to bring down, some people do for sure, but bring down the nation that has housed you and, and raised you in many ways. And for me, I think there's a real optimistic sort of potential to understand English identity, British identity, as something where we can have a conversation about the problems of the past and understand that there are things to be proud of in our history. People who resisted slavery, people always say, oh, well, back in that day, it was the norm to do that, but forgetting that, groups like the Quakers campaigned against slavery. There were always good people back in those darker times who were fighting for the good team, so to speak. And I think those are the ones, like you say, it's powerful people who get the statues. How about the people on the ground who are doing positive stuff, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a really powerful point, because I think often those who are kind of lined up as my opponents in this debate will say, all you want to do is to teach people that Britain was awful and that all Britain has ever done is terrible and British people are bad. And that's not the case. What I actually want to do is exactly what you say, is to celebrate the genuine good, not to pretend that bad things were good or to pretend that they didn't happen, which is dishonest and unhealthy. And if we can't reconcile ourselves with with a history of racism, how can we possibly tackle racism today? But there's so much to celebrate. I mean, again, come back to Glasgow, my city. It has taken us a century, but there is finally a statue in Glasgow to Mary Barber, who was the woman who led the rent strikes during the First World War. So the men went off to fight the war, and the landlords started ratcheting up the rent to the point where they couldn't afford it. So Mary Barber led Mary Barber's army, this massive movement of women in Glasgow who simply stopped paying rent and marched on the city chambers. And she was eventually elected as a councillor. Mary Barber had a huge impact in Glasgow, and it took a century to get a statue of her in Govan, the area that she's from. Our main square in Glasgow still has no statues to women. It has no statues to working class people, despite the fact that the best things that have happened in Glasgow's history happened because of generally working class women, but certainly some combination of women and the working class. I mean, my city has this incredible history of militant working class action. We have this history of what we call Red Clydeside, where trade unions collectively stood up for themselves and for each other. And we just have almost no general public. I mean, there's an element of kind of community history, and there's some people that are aware of it, but we don't teach children in Glasgow. Every child doesn't leave school in Glasgow knowing about Mary Barber or knowing about Red Clydeside. Folk I mentioned earlier, like Jimmy Reid, who fought to keep those shipyards open, to keep people employed during a devastating economic period. There's so much to be proud of and so much to celebrate, but it's generally stuff being driven by the groups of people who don't get to decide whether statues go up. And certainly in the past, we're not the people deciding whether or not statues went up. There should be statues in Bristol. I see the suggestion that the statue of where Colston's plinth is be replaced by a statue to the guy who led the Bristol bus boycott, which I think would be fantastic because he's still alive. So he would actually get to see that statue to him going up. That's the kind of history we should be celebrating. This isn't about condemning ourselves, absolutely, because there is so much about our history and our present that is worth celebrating. But it's about acknowledging that actually the stuff worth celebrating was often the resistance to the bad. It was often the resistance to the ruling class. It was often, the women's movement, people of color. It was the working classes, the LGBT movement. There are basically no significant monuments across this country to LGBT icons and those who fought for LGBT rights. There is so much good that we could and should celebrate. And it should be easy for us to say, yeah, there are far too many statues to rich old white men who did terrible things. And the only reason they have those statues are because they did terrible things. And would it really be so bad to take some of those down, or preferably take all of them down and put them in museums, and replace them with statues to people who we can all acknowledge are worth celebrating? Like that should be an easy and comfortable thing to do. And it's really worth delving into why, for some people, that is so uncomfortable and why it feels so threatening. And particularly its relationship to white identity politics. because every statue being taken down would be a statue to a white man, and a lot of the statues being put up to replace them would be statues to women. So the idea of like male fragility, I think, is a really interesting part of this. And a lot of the statues we'd be putting up would be to people of color. So the fragility of the white male version of British identity, and how core that is to you, how globally defined British identity is as a white male identity, is something that we really need to unpack if we want to say, actually, yeah, we're cool and comfortable with celebrating the brilliant stuff about this country, and we actually want to celebrate it. The people who don't want to celebrate the good are the people who are fighting tooth and nail to keep statues to slave owners up.
Completely agree with you. And yeah, it's there's a lot of work to be done, but I'm confident with people like you in politics, we'll get there. I really appreciate you talking to me today, Ross, and I'm sure you've got way too many video calls in your schedule, so I appreciate you adding one more for me. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, man. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Take care. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Cheers, guys. See you later on.